Bonjour, je
Hello,
m'appelle Sabri
my name
Adelsadi,
is Sabri
coordinateur de
Adetsadi,
l'implantation
Implementation
francophone au Centre
Coordinator
de recherche et
for
d'éducation sur la
Francophones at
violence
the
envers les
Center
femmes
for
et les enfants
Research and
à l'Université
Education
Western.
on Violence Against Women and Children at Western
Bienvenue au
University.
webinaire d'aujourd'hui.
Welcome to today's webinar,
Considérez le point de vue des
Considering
enfants concernant
Children's
les contacts
Perspectives
avec leur
on
père en
Contact with Their
contexte de violences
Fathers
conjugales
in the
post-séparation.
Context of Post-Separation
J'aimerais
Intimate
commencer
Partner
par une
Violence.
reconnaissance
I would
territoriale.
like to begin with a land acknowledgement.
Je souhaite reconnaître que nous
I
apprenons,
wish to
échangeons
acknowledge
et
that we are
organisons
learning,
cet événement
sharing, and
culturel
hosting
sur
this
les
virtual
territoires
event
traditionnels des
on the
nations
traditional territories
Anishinaabeg,
of the
Haudenosaunee,
Anishinaabeg,
Lunenpewac et
Haudenosaunee,
Shawanopi.
Lunapewak, and
Ces terres
Shawanoton
sont liées
nations.
au traité de
These
canton de
lands are
London
connected to
et
the
de
London and
Sombra de
Sombra Township
1796,
treaties of
ainsi qu'au
1796,
Dish
as
with One
well as
Spoon
the Dish with One
Covenant
Spoon
Wampum.
Covenant Wampum.
Aujourd'hui encore, ces
Today,
territoires
these
sont l'expression de nombreuses
territories are
personnes
still
autochtones
home to
provenant
many
de l'ensemble de
Indigenous
l'île de la
peoples
Tortue.
from across Turtle Island.
Nous exprimons notre
We
profond
express
respect
our
envers les
deep
premiers
respect
habitants de ces
for the
terres
first
et
inhabitants of these
reconnaissance qu'une reconnaissance du
lands
territoire et de la
and
souveraineté
recognize that
autochtone
acknowledging
s'accompagne d'une
Indigenous
responsabilité.
territories and sovereignty
Comprendre
comes with a
l'histoire et les impacts
responsibility to
continus du colonialisme.
understanding the history and
Ces
ongoing
impacts
impacts
continuent d'être
of
ressentis de
settler
manière disproportionnelle
colonialism.
et
These
quotidienne par les
impacts
communautés
continue to
autochtones.
be felt
Nous
disproportionately
réfléchissons
and on a
également à
daily
celles et ceux qui
basis
sont arrivés
by
sur ces terres
Indigenous
contre leur gré,
communities. We
en
also reflect
particulier
on
les
those who
personnes amenées
arrived
ici dans le
on
contexte
these lands
de la
against their will,
traite
in particular
transatlantique
those
des
brought
esclaves
here
et de
in the
l'esclavage.
context of the transatlantic slave trade
Nous reconnaissons
and
aussi
slavery.
qu'aujourd'hui, les
We
communautés
also
autochtones font
recognize that
face à une
today
forme disproportionnée
Indigenous
de violence
communities
fondée sur
face
le genre,
disproportionate
ainsi
forms
qu'à
of
la
gender
crise
based
des femmes et
violence,
des filles
as
autochtones
well as the
disparues
crisis
et
of
assassinées
missing
et
and
des
murdered
personnes
Indigenous women and girls and
LSLGBTQIA+.
2SLGBTQIA plus people.
Nous reconnaissons la
We recognize
responsabilité
the
que notre travail
responsibility that
soit
our work
informé
is
par les empreintes
informed
et les
by
torts
the
du colonialisme
legacies and
qui
harms
façonnent les
of
expériences de
colonialism that
violence
shape
fondées sur le genre dans
experiences
les
of
communautés
gender based
autochtones.
violence
Nous nous
in
engageons à
Indigenous
poursuivre notre
communities.
travail de
And
manière
we
à
commit to
soutenir la
continuing our work
solidarité
in a
avec les
manner that
survivantes
supports
autochtones et
solidarity with
celles et ceux qui
Indigenous
les accompagnent.
survivors and those who support them.
Le webinaire d'aujourd'hui
Today's
fait partie
webinar
de notre
is
série
part of our
continue
ongoing
organisée par le
series
Learning Network et le
organized
Centre de
by the
connaissances
Learning
au
Network
Centre
and
de
the
recherche
Knowledge
sur
Hub
l'éducation
at the Center for
sur la
Research and
recherche et
Education
l'éducation sur la
on
violence
Violence
faite aux femmes et
against
aux
women
enfants.
and children.
Le Learning Network
The
est
Learning
une
Network
initiative de
is a knowledge
mobilisation de connaissances
mobilization initiative
financée par le
funded by
gouvernement
the
de l'Ontario.
Government of Ontario.
Elle vise
It
à combler
aims to
l'écart
bridge the
entre la
gap
recherche
between
actuelle
current
sur la
research on
violence fondée
gender
sur le
based
genre, les
violence,
savoirs issus de la
practice
pratique et
based
les savoirs
knowledge,
expérientiels,
and
afin
experiential
de
knowledge
renforcer la
in order
capacité du
to
secteur et du
strengthen the
mouvement
capacity
contre
of
la
the
violence
sector
fondée
and
sur
the
le genre.
movement against gender based violence.
D'un autre côté, le centre de connaissances
The
facilite une
Knowledge Hub
communauté de pratique
facilitates a
informée par les
community of
approches tenant
practice
compte des traumatismes de
informed
la
by
violence,
trauma informed and
destinée
violence
aux
informed
projets menant des
approaches
programmes
for,
d'intervention et de
for
recherche
projects
pour la
conducting
cohabitation
intervention
vécue de la
and
violence
research
familiale
programs for people
financée
who have
par l'Agence de santé
experienced
publique du Canada.
gender based family violence, rather, funded by the Public Health Agency of
Avant de
Canada.
commencer, j'ai le plaisir de vous présenter notre
Before we
conférencier pour le
begin,
webinaire
I'm
d'aujourd'hui,
pleased to introduce
intitulé
to you our
Considérer le
speaker
point
for
de vue
today's
des
webinar,
enfants concernant le
entitled
contact avec leur père en contexte de
Considering
violence
Children's
conjugale
Perspectives on
post-séparation.
Contact with Their Fathers in the
Simon
Context
Lapierre
of
est professeur
Post-Separation
titulaire
Intimate
à
Partner
l'École de travail
Violence.
social de l'Université d'Ottawa
Simon
et
Lapierre is a
cofondateur
full
du
professor at the
collectif de recherche
University of
Femmes en
Ottawa
Vie
School
et
of
de
Social Work
l'Institut
and co-founder
PEVC.
of the Femmes en
Titulaire
Vie
d'un doctorat de
Research
l'Université de
Collective and the
Cardiff au
PEVC
Royaume-Uni, ses
Institute.
travaux se
He
sont
holds a
penchés sur la
doctorate
violence
from the
sexuelle et les
University of
contrôles
Warwick in the
coercitifs.
United Kingdom, and
Il
his
s'est
work
aussi
has
intéressé aux
focused on
pratiques
intimate
d'intervention dans
partner
le milieu
violence and
d'enfants, en
coercive
protection de
control.
la jeunesse
He has
et dans
also
le
taken
système
an
de
interest in
justice.
intervention practices
Il
in
est l'auteur de
shelters,
plusieurs
youth
articles et
protection,
livres,
and the justice
incluant
system.
Contrôle
He's the author
coercitif,
of several
Normes,
articles and books,
Politique
including
et pratiques en
Coercive
matière de
Control
violence
Laws and
conjugale,
Policies and
ainsi
Practices
que
in
le meilleur
Intimate Partner
intérêt des
Violence,
enfants victimes de
the
violences
best
conjugales
interests
et
of
il
children
s'exprimait pour le
victims
droit de la maison
of
des enfants parlent de la violence
intimate
conjugale.
partner violence, and he thought
Simon,
he was
c'est
the
un
king of the
gravis de vous
house.
accueillir
Children talk
aujourd'hui.
about
Je vous cède maintenant la parole
IPV.
et une fois la
Simon,
présentation
we're
terminée,
delighted to welcome
Katrina
you.
se joindra à
I
moi
will
pour
turn
animer
the
la
floor over
modération.
to you, and once the
Merci.
presentation is over, Katrina will join
Merci
you to
beaucoup,
moderate the
Sabri,
question period. Thank
pour
you.
l'introduction. Merci
Thank you
également à
very
toute
much
l'équipe.
for your
Simone,
introduction, Sabri.
Yeah, oui.
Simone, sorry.
Sorry.
Before we start,
Yeah.
I am sorry, let me go to the regular channel. Just before we start, I know that there's a lot of questions and about language and how to access both the English slides and the English audio. This webinar, I'm speaking English on this channel right now, but this webinar will be offered in French and in English. In order to get the English translation, you need to go to the interpretation button and hit English under the audio settings. Okay, go ahead, Simone.
Thank you. Merci, merci Katrina.
Thank you
Alors,
very much, Katrina.
je remerciais Sabri pour
I was thanking Sabri
l'introduction et toute
for the
l'équipe,
introduction
Katrina
and
pour,
thanks to the
pour
team,
l'invitation. En
including
fait, je suis
Katrina, for
très
having
heureux d'être
invited
avec
me.
vous
I'm
ce
really happy to be
midi,
here with you
après-midi,
today, this
pour vous
afternoon, to
présenter
talk to
quelques
you
résultats issus d'une
about some of
recherche
the results
que
from a
j'ai eu
research
l'occasion de réaliser
project
avec des collègues,
that
mais
I
surtout
carried out with my
avec
colleagues,
un groupe
and in particular with a
d'enfants et
group
de
of
jeunes
children
qui
and
ont
youth
vécu dans un contexte de violence
who
conjugale.
lived in an intimate
La
partner, in
présentation
a
de ce
home with
projet
intimate
et la
partner
présentation, comme vous
violence.
pouvez le voir,
And
porte
as you
plus
can
spécifiquement
see,
sur
I'm going to be
l'expérience et le
dealing
point de vue des
directly
enfants
with the
concernant le
experience and the
contact avec leur
perspectives
père dans
of
un contexte de
children
violence
with respect to contact
post-séparation.
with their father in the
Alors,
context of post-separation
en
intimate
fait,
partner
l'essentiel
violence.
de ma présentation
Most of my
va
presentation
porter sur l'expérience et le
will
point de vue des
look
enfants.
at the
Et vous allez
experience and
voir à travers ma
children's
présentation qu'il y aura
perspectives on
beaucoup
violence.
d'extraits, de
As you will
citations,
see, there will be a lot of
d'entretiens que
quotes
nous avons réalisés
from
avec
interviews
des
that we
enfants et des
held with
jeunes.
these children and
J'aurai
youth.
probablement d'ailleurs pas le temps de
You
toutes
probably
lire les
won't have
citations
time to
en
read
cours de
all
présentation,
these
mais
quotes
comme je te le
during the
mentionnais plus tôt, vous
presentation,
aurez
but as
accès
mentioned
au
earlier
PowerPoint
on,
par la
you
suite,
will
donc
have
vous pourrez
access
retourner lire
to the
certaines des
PowerPoint
citations.
and you'll
Alors,
be
les
able
citations
to
qui sont très,
go over
très
them again.
riches
These quotes
et
are
puissantes,
very
mais
rich
juste
and very
avant
powerful.
de,
But before
d'arriver aux résultats, donc au point de
going
vue et
right
à l'expérience
into
des enfants et
the
des adolescents
project, its results, and
qui
the
ont participé au projet,
children's perspective,
je trouvais qu'il
I
était quand
would
même
like
important de
to
contextualiser un peu ce
put
projet-là, de
this
donner quelques
project
éléments
in
de
context
contexte pour mieux
and
situer
give you a better idea of
où
what we were
dans quoi
doing so
s'inscrivent en
you'll
fait les
understand
résultats de la recherche. En fait, je
the
pense que c'est
results of
important de
this
reconnaître
research.
que
I think
quand
it's
même au
important
cours des
to
dernières
recognize that
décennies,
over the last
il y a une
few decades,
quantité quand même impressionnante de
there's
recherches qui ont
been a
été
great
réalisées
deal of
sur
research
la
done
situation des enfants
on the situation of
qui vivent dans un
children
contexte de
who
violence
are
conjugale. On
living
comprend de mieux en
with
mieux en fait
intimate partner
la situation
violence.
des enfants qui vivent dans un
We
contexte de violence
understand much
conjugale
better
et de
the
plus en
lives of these
plus on
children,
reconnaît
and
que les
more,
enfants
we
sont
recognize that
affectés par la violence
children are
conjugale et
affected
de plus
by
en plus on les
intimate
reconnaît
partner
même comme une
violence,
victime à
and
part
we
entière en
they
fait
are
de la
now
violence conjugale ou de la
recognized as
violence qui est exercée
full-fledged victims
d'abord
of
et avant tout
intimate partner violence.
envers leur mère. On
And
reconnaît
most of this
aussi
violence is towards their
de
mothers.
plus en plus que les
More and
enfants
more, we're
qui
also
vivent dans un
seeing
contexte de
that
violence
children
conjugale,
living
comme tous les enfants
with
par ailleurs,
intimate
ont des
partner
droits,
violence,
mais
as
que
all
le
children,
fait de vivre dans
have
un contexte de
rights.
violence
And the
conjugale,
fact that they're
évidemment,
living with intimate
a
partner
des impacts
violence
sur les droits des
has an
enfants,
impact on
constitue souvent même
children's
une
rights.
violation
And
certains de leurs
some
droits, et
of
on reconnaît de
their
plus en
rights
plus
are
que dans
violated.
les
And we
interventions qu'on
recognize
met en
more and
place,
more
on
that
doit
when we work with
s'assurer
these
en fait qu'on
children, we have to
respecte
make
les
sure
droits des
that we
enfants
respect the
et
children's
notamment
rights,
le
in
droit à la
particular, their
protection, le droit
right
d'être en
to
sécurité, mais
protection, to be
aussi de plus en plus
safe,
on reconnaît
and
que les enfants ont aussi
more,
le droit de
we recognize
participer
that children
dans
have the
les
right to participate
processus
in
décisionnels qui les
the
concernent, ont le droit d'être
decision-making
entendus et je
processes
reviendrai
that
par ailleurs sur
affect
ces
them.
droits-là qui
And I
sont
will come
prévus
back to talk
notamment
about these rights that are
par
provided for
la Convention internationale
in
relative
the
aux droits
International
des enfants.
Convention
J'y
on
reviendrai plus
Children's
tard, mais
Rights.
de plus
I'll
en plus,
come
c'est
back to
reconnu
this
qu'on
later.
doit
But
s'assurer
more
à
and
travers nos
more,
interventions
we
qu'on respecte
recognize
les droits,
and
les droits des
we
enfants.
work
Par
to
ailleurs, lorsqu'on parle des
ensure that
comportements
children's
des
rights are
auteurs de violences
respected.
conjugales, qui
Now, when you
sont
talk about the
dans la
behavior
majorité des
of
cas des
the
hommes, qui sont
violent
souvent les
behavior
pères
usually committed by the
des enfants,
fathers
évidemment, qui vivent
of
dans un
these
contexte de
children,
violence,
um,
de plus en plus,
more
en
and
fait, on
more, we're
reconnaît que
seeing
le
that, or
recours
we're
à la violence
recognizing that
conjugale
the use
constitue
of
aussi
intimate partner
un choix
violence
parental.
is
Alors
a
que pendant un
parental
certain temps,
choice.
on
For
a
some
vu
time,
la violence
we
conjugale et la
thought
parentalité comme étant
that
deux choses
parenting
distinctes et
and
séparées,
intimate partner
ce qui nous
violence were
amenait
two
parfois
separate things,
à
which
dire, par
often led
exemple,
us to
que
say
un
that,
parent
for instance,
violent, un auteur de violence
a
conjugale, peut
violent
tout à
parent
fait être un bon
can
père.
still be a good father.
De plus en plus, on
More and
reconnaît
more, we are
que le
recognizing that
choix pour ces hommes-là d'avoir recours à la violence, à
these
différentes
men's
stratégies de
choosing to
contrôle, de
use
privation de
violence
liberté.
or
C'est un choix qu'ils
control
font dans le cadre
is
de leur
a
relation
choice
conjugale,
that they
mais
make
c'est aussi
within
un choix
their
parental qui, par
relationship, but it's
ailleurs,
also a parenting
comme
choice.
je le mentionnais plus
And
tôt,
as I mentioned
affecte
earlier, this
les enfants
affects
et a des
children
impacts
and has an
sur les enfants.
impact
Et de plus en
on
plus,
the
donc, on
children.
reconnaît que,
So
en fait,
we're recognizing more and more that
pour les hommes, en fait, les parents qui ont recours à ces
parents
comportements-là, à ces
that
stratégies-là,
use these
c'est
violent
non seulement un
strategies and
choix parental,
behaviors,
mais c'est
it's not
donc
only a
aussi un
parenting
indicateur de
choice,
certaines
and it's
lacunes
also
significatives
an
sur le
indicator
plan
of certain
de leurs habiletés
weaknesses or
parentales, de leurs
gaps
capacités
in their
parentales, parce
parenting
que ces
skills.
parents-là font le
Because
choix
these
d'exposer
parents
leurs enfants
decide
à
to
la violence
expose their children
conjugale, font des
to
choix qui
intimate
affectent la
partner
sécurité et
violence,
le
and they
bien-être
make
des enfants
choices that
et,
affect the safety of the
et,
children.
et donc ça constitue une
And
lacune au niveau de leur
so
capacité
this is
parentale. Et ça,
therefore a weekness in
je
their
dirais que c'est un
ability
champ qui
to
est
be a good
encore en
parent.
émergence, mais
This
qui
is
de plus en plus
a field that's
est
still
reconnu là,
emerging,
également
but is
dans la
recognized
littérature.
more and more in the
Et
literature.
finalement,
And
ce
finally,
qu'on sait aussi,
what we also know,
ce qu'on connaît aussi à partir de la littérature, c'est
what we've
que
also seen
dans
through
un
the
contexte
literature, is
post-séparation,
that in the post-separation
ben,
context,
d'abord, dans un contexte post-séparation, la violence conjugale va souvent, le schéma de
intimate
comportement des auteurs de violence
partner
conjugale va souvent
violence
être maintenu durant la période
often
post-séparation. Mais
is
malgré
maintained.
ça, les
But
professionnels
despite
qui sont
this, the
impliqués dans les
professionals
différents systèmes, dans les différentes
who work
procédures,
in the
vont
system and
avoir
uh,
tendance à
tend
favoriser
still
le maintien
to
des contacts
encourage
entre les enfants et leurs
continuing
pères,
contact between children and their
malgré
fathers,
la violence, malgré les
despite the
comportements
violence
violents,
and
et
despite the
que la
violent
majorité,
behavior.
ben, dans les faits, en
And
fait, la
in
majorité des enfants
fact,
qui ont
the
vécu dans un
majority
contexte de
of
violence
children
conjugale
who have
continuent
lived in
d'avoir un contact
an intimate
avec
partner
leur
violence
père
environment
suite à la
continue to
séparation,
have contact with their fathers
nonobstant parfois le
after the
maintien là, du schéma
separation,
de comportement de
notwithstanding
cette
the
période-là.
fact
Donc,
that the violence
on voit
continues.
bien qu'on commence à
So
avoir de plus en plus de
we're
connaissances
seeing
sur
that
la réalité des
we're
enfants qui
learning a
vivent
lot
dans un
more
contexte de
and
violence
more
conjugale, sur la
about children
parentalité
living
dans un contexte de
in
violence
these
conjugale et sur
environments,
les
on
interventions
parenting,
les
and
discours et les
what
pratiques
kinds
qui
of
sont souvent
practices and
présents
interventions
lorsque on intervient auprès des enfants
that
qui
are
vivent dans un contexte de
used
violence conjugale,
when we're working
notamment dans un
with
contexte
children living with intimate
post-séparation,
partner
mais
violence, in
quand
particular
même,
after the
malgré tout ça, et
separation.
c'est un peu ce
But
que l'image à
despite all
l'écran
of this, and
indique, il y a
that's
quand même
what
un
you see on
morceau
the
du
screen,
casse-tête
there is still a piece of the
qui
puzzle
est
missing.
au centre
You can
du
see it, it's
casse-tête,
right
qui
in
est
the middle of
important,
the
mais
puzzle, and it's
qui manque
important.
quand même
But
lorsqu'on
it's
regarde
missing.
l'état des
When
connaissances
you look
sur
at
cette question-là,
the
et
knowledge that we
c'est
have on this
l'expérience et
issue,
le point de vue des
and
enfants
what's
eux-mêmes
missing is the
sur
knowledge and the
les
experience of
contacts, sur la
children
relation avec leur
themselves
père dans un
on their
contexte
contact and their
de violence
relationships
conjugale
with their father
post-séparation. Donc ce
after the
morceau-là, il est,
separation.
de notre point
This
de vue,
piece,
c'est ce qui nous a amené en
in
fait
our
à
opinion,
réaliser
and
cette
that's
recherche-là.
indeed
Ce
why
morceau-là, il est
we
essentiel pour avoir
did
vraiment
this
une vision
research.
plus
This
complète
piece is
des
essential if we
enjeux
want to
et pour
have
pouvoir
a
dégager des pistes
better
d'intervention qui vont davantage
understanding
respecter les
of the
droits des enfants, mais
situation
qui vont aussi être davantage
and be
adaptées
able to
à leur
act
réalité
in
et à
the best
et
interests
à
of the
leurs besoins.
child, respect them,
Donc,
and meet their
ça nous a amené
needs.
en fait
So this, in
quelques années
fact, a few
à
years ago,
débuter une
led
recherche
us to
qui
start
visait
a
en fait
research project,
spécifiquement à documenter l'expérience
which
et le point de vue des
to
enfants
document the experience and
en lien
perspectives of
avec
children
la relation parent-enfant et les contacts
and
parent-enfant
their
dans un contexte de violence conjugale
relationships
post-séparation, une recherche qui a
during
été
the
financée par le
separation
Conseil de
intimate
recherche en sciences
partner violence in
sociales et humaines du
period.
Canada.
And this was
Et ce
funded
projet-là, en
by
fait,
the government of Canada.
et je vais y revenir un peu plus tard, mais bien que le sujet
I-
principal
and
de la
although
recherche
the
visait
main
à
topic of the
documenter,
research
à mieux
was to
comprendre
document
l'expérience et le point de vue
and
des
better
enfants en
understand the
lien
experience and
spécifiquement avec les
perspectives of
contacts
children
père-enfant dans un
um,
contexte de violence conjugale
in terms of their
post-séparation,
contact
un
with
élément
a
qui
father
est
in a
devenu
post-separation
central dans le
context.
projet. En
Something
fait,
that
c'est toute la question
became
de la
important during the
participation des
research
enfants et
was
dans
the
quelle mesure est-ce que
participation of
les
the children
enfants
and to what
ont
extent
l'occasion de participer
the children
à
have an
être impliqués, de
opportunity
participer
to
dans les
participate
procédures
and be
qui nous
involved
amènent comme
in
professionnels à prendre
the
des décisions
procedures
concernant les
leading
contacts parents-enfants.
to
Donc, on va aussi revenir là, dans
decisions
quelques instants
regarding
sur
their
cet
contact with their
aspect de la
fathers. And I'll come
participation et de
back to this
l'implication des
later.
enfants
In
dans
other
les
words, the
procédures
participation
qui les
of
concernent.
and their
Mais
perspective
brièvement,
in these
le projet de
procedures.
recherche, en fait, est un
But the
projet qui
research
s'étendait
project
sur 5 ans, donc qui est un projet quand même assez large,
is a
avec
5-year
différentes,
project,
qui comprenait en
and
fait différentes composantes.
it had
Et
several
l'une des
components to it.
composantes était de
One of
mettre en
them
place
was to
dès le
establish
départ un
at the
comité de
outset a
jeunes
working committee
co-chercheurs.
with
Donc, c'était
children as
important pour nous de
co-researchers.
favoriser
It
à
was
l'intérieur
important for
même du
us
projet de recherche la participation
to
des enfants et de
encourage and
reconnaître
foster
leur vécu et
children's
leur expertise
participation
sur la question.
within the research
Alors, on a
itself.
créé dès le
So we
départ un comité
created
de jeunes co-chercheurs
this
qui ont
working committee
été
with
impliqués à
young
toutes les étapes
co-researchers,
jusqu'à
and
maintenant,
they
en fait,
were
là, à toutes
involved
les étapes du processus de
in
recherche.
every step
Donc, les
of the
jeunes ont
research process.
participé au
The
développement
young
du
people
dossier de recherche, des
participated
outils de collecte
in
de
the
données, de
research
l'analyse,
questions,
des
the
activités de
data
diffusion, de
collection
vulgarisation des connaissances. Donc, ils
process,
ont vraiment été là
knowledge
impliqués à toutes les
mobilization,
étapes du
the
processus.
survey.
Vous avez,
They were there
vous
throughout the
voyez là à l'écran
process.
une image
As
une
you can
photo
see on the screen, there's a
qu'on a
picture
prise lors
there,
d'une rencontre
a
avec
picture that
certains
we took
collègues
with a few of
qui
our
participent au
colleagues
projet
who
et
were
certains
participating
jeunes
in
du
the project
comité
and a
également.
couple of
Et
the
je pense
young
que ce qui
people
est important
who
de
were
mentionner, et on
co-researchers. It's
pourrait faire
also
toute une
important to
présentation sur
mention,
la
and I could
participation des
give
jeunes dans
a
le cadre d'un
whole
projet comme
presentation
celui-là,
of how
mais
the
je pense
youth
que quand même,
participated in
s'il y a une
this
leçon que je
research. But if
retiens
there's
personnellement
one
de
lesson to
cette
be drawn
initiative-là,
from
c'est que
this
ça vaut le
initiative,
coup de
it's
créer
that
des
it's
espaces où les
really
jeunes ont des
worthwhile
occasions de
to create
participer, d'être
spaces for young
impliqués,
people so
parce
they
qu'on
can
s'est
be
rendu compte, en
involved,
fait,
because we
que
realized
alors qu'au
that
départ,
at the begin, whereas
notre
at the
plan était
beginning, our
d'impliquer
plan
des
was to
jeunes dans un
involve
comité
the
qui allait
young
se
people in a
rencontrer
committee
trois,
that
quatre
would
fois par
meet
année.
3 or 4
Dès qu'on a
times a year.
commencé à
As soon
impliquer les
as we
jeunes,
started
en fait, les
involving
jeunes
the young
eux-mêmes ont
people, the
demandé
young
qu'on se
people
rencontre plus
themselves
souvent, qu'ils
asked
pouvaient
to
se
meet with
rencontrer à
us
chaque
more
semaine, à
often,
chaque 2 semaines.
every
Et
week or
finalement, les
every
rencontres ont
second
été
week.
beaucoup plus
And
fréquentes que
often
ce qu'on
there were
pensait et les
much
jeunes
more
ont été
frequent
beaucoup
meetings
plus
than we
engagés et
expected, and
impliqués
people were a
que ce
lot
qu'on
more
avait, qu'on
committed
aurait pu
and
anticiper
involved
au
than
départ.
we
Et on
might
doit
have
dire que la
expected at the
participation des
beginning.
jeunes à toutes
And
les
the
étapes du projet
participation of
a
these young
probablement
people
complètement
at every
transformé
step in the
le projet,
project
qui est devenu
probably
probablement complètement
completely
différent de ce
changed the
qu'il aurait
project,
été sans
which would have been
leur implication
totally
dans le
different
projet.
had they
On n'en
not
dirait
been
pas plus
involved
pour
in the
l'instant,
project.
mais
So I won't go on
je voulais
with
vraiment
this
souligner la participation des
further,
jeunes
but I just wanted to underscore
et
the
les remercier là
participation of the
aussi pour
young people
leur
and
contribution au
thank them
projet.
for their contribution to the
Et
project.
remercier là, par ailleurs mes collègues
And
aussi là,
thank my
qui ont
colleagues
participé
too,
aussi à
who
toutes les étapes du
participated
projet.
in every step
La
of the
deuxième
project. The
composante
second
du projet était une
component of the
analyse des
project
données secondaires.
was
Donc, on a aussi fait une
analyzing
analyse
secondary
de rapports
data
d'expertise qui ont été produits
from
dans un contexte
experts' reports that were
d'antécédage
produced
post-séparation. On a
in this
ensuite
context of
conduit,
IPV
réalisé des
post-separation.
entrevues
And we also
individuelles
did
et des focus groups
individual
avec des
interviews
jeunes.
and focus groups with the young
L'étape
people.
subséquente ou l'autre
Then
composante, il y a
the
aussi
next
un
component
sondage
was a
qui est toujours en
survey,
cours. En fait, cette
and the survey
composante-là
is
n'est pas
ongoing.
terminée.
It's
Et
not finished
finalement,
yet. And
il y a
finally,
aussi là, dans les
there
composantes différentes
uh,
actions qui
we
visent
also
la diffusion, la mobilisation des connaissances,
worked on
mais qui visent
knowledge
aussi un changement
mobilization and
social plus large et
dissemination,
qui implique
the
les
goal
jeunes
being social
dans les
change.
dans ces
And
différentes activités-là. Donc
and
aujourd'hui,
we
en fait, on
involve
va
the
se
young people in
concentrer
these
sur
activities too.
les
So now we're
données
going
qui ont
to
émané des
um,
entretiens individuels.
see what came out of the individual
Oups, je suis
interviews.
désolé, j'ai changé trop
Sorry,
vite la
I changed the
diapositive.
slide too fast in French.
Voilà.
Here we go with
Donc,
the
on va se
methodology.
concentrer uniquement aujourd'hui
Today,
sur les
we're just
données
going to
qui
look
ont
at the
émergé de
data
l'entretien
that came out
individuel.
of the
En
individual
fait,
interviews.
on a réalisé dans le cadre du projet
Within the
des
project,
entretiens
we
avec
carried out
auprès de
interviews
19 enfants.
with
Les
19
enfants ont été
children.
recrutés
They were
de
recruited
différentes façons. Ils ont
from
notamment été
in
recrutés par
different
l'entremise
ways,
de maisons d'hébergement,
some
mais
through
aussi par
shelters and
l'entremise d'autres organismes
also through
partenaires
other
et
partner
également via
organizations,
les
as well
réseaux
as
et les médias
through
sociaux. Et,
social media and other
et
networks.
dans le cadre de cette
And
composante-là, on a vraiment réalisé
we
un entretien individuel
did
avec chaque
individual
participant. Et
interviews
l'objectif était
with
de
each
recueillir
participant
leur
in
expérience et
order
leur point de vue là,
to gather
en
their
lien toujours
perspective
avec les
and their
contacts, les relations et les
experiences
contacts par enfants dans un contexte post-séparation.
with
En fait, vous voyez à
their
l'écran les
parents after
différentes
the separation.
caractéristiques de
Now you can
l'échantillon.
see the
Mais je pense que
characteristics
ce
of
que
the
je vais mentionner ici,
participants.
c'est qu'il y avait
What I'd like
19
to
enfants
underscore here
qui ont été
was that there were
impliqués dans
19
cette composante
children
du projet.
involved
Ces
in this
enfants-là
part of the
étaient
project.
âgés entre
They
5
were aged
et
between
17 ans.
5 and 17
Et on
years of age,
constate là,
and
qu'il y avait
we
quand même une
and
certaine diversité, là,
there
que ce
was
soit
a
en
certain
fonction
amount of diversity
du genre,
there in terms
l'identité
of
de genre,
gender
de la
identity,
langue, de la religion,
language,
du pays d'origine. Donc, il y avait quand
religion,
même une
and the
certaine
country of origin.
diversité qui est intéressante
So
à travers l'échantillon.
the
Et
diversity
évidemment,
was
on a fait par la suite une analyse des
striking.
données.
And then
Alors, ce que je vais vous
we
présenter, en fait,
did the
c'est
data analysis. What I'd like to present
les données en
now
fonction de
is the
4
data
thèmes ou de 4 dimensions
that we've
qui ont
separated into
émergé
4
des résultats.
themes that
Donc, je vais
came
me
out of the
pencher dans un
results.
premier temps
So
sur la
first of
question
all, we're
de la
going to look
participation
at
des enfants
fostering
dans les
child
processus
participation
décisionnels.
in the
Comme
decision-making
j'y faisais
processes.
référence un peu plus tôt, c'était pas
As I said
nécessairement
earlier on,
l'objectif
this was not
primaire du projet au
necessarily our
départ, mais c'est
main objective
devenu,
when we
notamment à
started
travers des
the
discussions avec les jeunes
research,
mensualités,
but
des
as
jeunes
we
co-chercheurs, c'est devenu un aspect
worked with these
important du projet,
co-researchers, we
cette
realized
dimension
that
de la
this was a
participation
very
ou de la
important aspect of the
non-participation
research.
parfois
In other
des
words, the
jeunes dans les
participation or
processus
sometimes the
décisionnels,
non-participation of
toujours en
children
lien avec
in
les contacts
decision-making processes
parents-enfants. Le deuxième thème
related
sur lequel on
to
va se pencher par la
parent-child
suite, c'est de
contact.
voir un peu plus
Then
spécifiquement
we're
quelle est
going to look
l'expérience
more
que les enfants
specifically
rapportent
at
en
the
lien avec les
experiences
contacts
that the
avec leur
children
père.
talked
On va
about
ensuite
in contact
se
with their
pencher sur
father.
les conditions. Donc,
And
quelles sont les
then we'll look
conditions
at the
que
conditions,
les participants
the
auraient
conditions
aimé
that the
mettre en...
participants
Quelles
would
conditions est-ce
have
qu'ils auraient
liked
aimé
to have
qu'elles soient mises
seen,
en place
would have liked to have
pour
seen
permettre
implemented to
de se sentir en sécurité
enable
et
them to feel
confortable en lien
safe
avec le
and
contact père-enfant.
comfortable
Et finalement,
in the
rapidement,
parent-child
en fin de
contact.
présentation, on abordera la
And
question de la
then
réparation.
we're going to
Donc, est-ce qu'on
talk about
devrait envisager un processus de
reparations, if you
réparation
will,
pour les enfants qui ont
for children
vécu dans un contexte
who have lived
de violence
in
conjugale?
an intimate
Donc,
partner
pour ce
violence
qui est de
environment.
la
Now,
participation des
in
enfants,
terms of
en
child
fait,
participation,
on s'est intéressé plus
we
spécifiquement
looked
à la participation des
specifically
enfants dans
at
les procédures
how
en droit familial
children
et en
participated
protection
in the
de
family
la
law
jeunesse.
procedures and in
Probablement
child
que
protective
certaines
services
personnes qui
procedures.
assistent au webinaire ce
Some
midi se
people
disent, oui, mais c'est quand même des
say, yes, but
procédures
these are
distinctes, différentes,
procedures
qui
which
sont appelées
are
parfois des
different from
acteurs ou
each other,
qui sont différents.
and
C'est
there are certain
effectivement le
and
cas,
different
mais dans la
players are
mesure
involved. Yes,
où
that's
ce qui nous
true.
intéressait,
But
c'était
in
l'expérience et le
but
point de
what
vue
we
des
were
enfants
interested in was the
concernant les
children's
contacts par-enfants
experience and
pour
their
les enfants
perspectives.
qu'on a rencontrés dans le cadre du projet,
And
qui ont été impliqués aussi dans le
the
comité de
children
jeunes. En fait,
that
c'était
for the children with whom we
pour eux,
met,
ces
we saw that
personnes-là, c'est
for
ces
them,
intervenants-là,
these
que ce
people,
soit ceux
these
qui
individuals,
interviennent dans le
be it
cadre de procédures en droit familial
those
ou que ce
who
soit
were
ceux qui
involved in
interviennent dans le
family
cadre de procédures en
law
protection de la
or
jeunesse,
those who
c'est
were
globalement
involved in
ces
child protection
intervenants-là qui
services,
prennent des
these
décisions ou qui ont
people,
pris des
they saw them
décisions
as the
en
decision
lien
makers
avec les contacts que ces
related
enfants-là ont eu ou n'ont pas eu avec leur
to
père. Donc,
the contact that these children did or didn't have with
c'était
their fathers.
plus intéressant et
So
plus
it
cohérent, en
was
fait,
more
de
interesting
s'intéresser
and
globalement aux
meaningful
professionnels
to
dans ces
look at
deux
these people
structures-là,
as
parce que ça reflétait
one
mieux, en fait,
group,
le point de
because
vue et
this really
l'expérience des
reflected the
enfants
point of view
eux-mêmes, qui ne font pas
and the
nécessairement
reflection and
la
the
distinction
perspectives of
entre
the
un
children
système
who
et l'autre.
didn't
Et
necessarily
en fait,
distinguish
quand on
between
s'est intéressé
one or
à
one
la
system or the other.
participation des enfants,
Now, we,
on est tombé
in
en
terms
fait
of
sur
children's
les écrits
participation,
notamment de Laura
we
Lundy, les travaux de Laura Lundy, qui est une
we
chercheure
saw, we looked at the
de
work by
l'Irlande du
Laura
Nord qui
Allen
a beaucoup
Dee
travaillé
from
sur
Northern
la
Ireland, who
participation des
has
enfants
worked a
dans un
great deal
contexte
on
qui est dans
children's
l'éducation, donc dans un
participation
contexte qui est quand même différent,
in
mais on
the
trouvait quand
education
même
sector. It's a
que
different
le
sector,
modèle qui était
but we
proposé
saw
par
that
Laura
the
Lundy
model
faisait
that
beaucoup de
Laura Landy
sens et nous aidait vraiment
proposed
à
made a lot of sense
analyser
and
les
helped us
données qui
to
émergeaient là,
influence
des
the
entretiens
data that came
avec,
out of
avec
these
les jeunes. En fait, Laura Lundy,
interviews with the
son
children.
modèle
Laura Landy,
a
the model that
démontré ou a mis de
what
l'avant,
her
c'est
model
que
showed
d'abord, les
was that
professionnels doivent
first
s'assurer
professionals have to
de
ensure
mettre en place certaines
that
conditions pour
they
permettre aux
establish
enfants
certain conditions
d'avoir
to
une
enable the
participation
children
pleine et entière
to
dans les
fully
différents
participate
processus
in the various
décisionnels.
decision-making
Donc, la
processes.
participation, elle aller importante,
procedures.
mais
So
requiert certaines
participation is
conditions. Et
important,
Laura
but
Lundy,
it can only happen under certain
comme
conditions.
nous,
And Laura Lundy said,
insiste sur le
as
fait que
we
c'est pas
say,
seulement une
that
question
it's
d'habileté
not just a
professionnelle,
question
c'est une
of
question de
professional skills,
responsabilité légale.
it's a
Donc, on a,
question
en
of
vertu notamment
legal
de la révision du Canada à la
responsibilities
Convention
or
internationale
accountabilities.
relative aux droits des enfants, on a
We have to
l'obligation de
respect, we have an
respecter les droits
obligation
des enfants,
to
notamment
respect
le droit
children's rights,
d'être
in
entendu
particular, the
et de
right to be
participer.
heard
Et
and the
dans son
right to
modèle,
participate. And in
Lundy,
her
en fait,
model, Lundy
dégage quatre
um,
dimensions ou quatre conditions
focuses on
qui doivent être
four
présentes pour
dimensions or
permettre
conditions
une
that have to be
participation
present
élémentaire des
to
enfants.
enable the
Et
children to
nous,
fully
à partir
participate.
des
And
données
we,
des
based
entretiens
on
qu'on a
the data
réalisés,
or
en fait, il y a
on
une
the
cinquième
interviews that
dimension
we
qui,
did, we
qui a
added
émergé et
a
qui est
fifth
extrêmement importante
dimension, which is
pour
extremely important
les
for
enfants qui ont participé au projet.
children who
Donc, on va revenir en
participated in
fait
the project.
sur chacune
We'll
de ces
come back
dimensions-là
to
et on va
each of
regarder
these
qu'est-ce que
dimensions and we'll
les
see
enfants et les
what
jeunes
the
nous ont
children
dit.
and the youth
Mais
said
les
to us
quatre
about them.
dimensions qui
But
sont
the
mises de
four
l'avant par Laura
dimensions
Lundy sont
that Laura Lundy
l'espace, la
highlighted were
voix,
space, the
l'audience
voice, the
et
hearing,
l'influence. Donc, tout
and
ça doit
influence.
être mis en
All of
place pour
this,
permettre
all
une
of these
participation
conditions
pleine et
have to
entière des
exist
enfants.
in order for the children to
Et de
fully
nos données, il a
participate.
émergé la
And
cinquième
from
dimension,
our data,
c'est-à-dire
we
l'information. Donc, pour
added
les
a
jeunes qui ont
fifth
participé au
dimension,
projet,
information. For
il
the
est
young people who
aussi nécessaire
participated in the
d'avoir accès à
project, it
l'information,
was
de cette
also
manière-là,
important for
ils
them
peuvent
to have
pouvoir
access
être en
to
mesure de
information
participer là, de manière
in order
significative dans le
to be able
processus
to
décisionnel.
fully participate
Donc, on
in
va
the
revenir
decision-making
sur chacune,
process.
sur,
So
sur
we'll come
chacun
back to
de
each
ces
of
éléments-là.
these
En fait, le
elements.
premier élément,
The
l'espace, fait
first
vraiment
element,
référence au fait que
space,
les enfants
refers to the fact
doivent,
that children,
qu'on doit en fait comme professionnels
that as
fournir aux
professionals,
enfants
we
un
have to
espace,
give
c'est-à-dire
children
des
a
opportunités,
space,
des
an
occasions de
opportunity
pouvoir
and
exprimer leur point de
opportunities
vue
to
et on
express
doit
their
créer des
point of view,
espaces, bien
and we
évidemment,
have to
qui vont
create
être
spaces
notamment
that
sécuritaires,
are
confortables,
safe
accueillants
and
pour que les enfants se
comfortable and
sentent
welcoming so that
confortables,
children
se sentent à
feel
l'aise là, finalement
comfortable
de,
and
d'exprimer
able to
leur opinion
express their
et leur point de
opinions
vue.
and their point of view.
Malheureusement, dans les entretiens qu'on a réalisés avec
Unfortunately,
les
in the
enfants,
interviews we carried out
il y a
with the
quand même
children,
plusieurs enfants qui ont
there are a number of the
souligné le fait
children
qu'ils avaient
who
eu
raised the
peu
fact
ou pas
that they had very
d'opportunités
few or no
d'exprimer
opportunities
leur point de
at
vue
all
en
to
lien
express their
avec les
viewpoints
contacts
when it came
avec leur
to
père.
the contact that they had had with their
Comme
father.
vous le voyez dans
And
la première
as you can
citation qui est
see
ici
in
à
the first
l'écran,
quote, which you see here
Bunny
on
nous dit,
screen,
ben, en fait, ils m'ont même pas
the
posé de
bunny told us
questions à ce sujet-là.
they didn't even
Donc, il y avait
ask any
vraiment,
questions
chez
about
plusieurs
that.
enfants, plusieurs
In a
enfants qui ont
number of
participé au projet ont
children and
déploré le
those who
fait
took part of
qu'on
the
leur a pas
project
posé de
said
questions,
that
on
it
les a
was
pas
unfortunately that no
consultés
questions were
et qu'ils
put
ont
to
eu
them, that they
finalement
were not
peu
consulted,
d'occasions de
and they had few
partager leur
opportunities,
point
in
de vue
fact,
sur les
to
contacts
share their viewpoints
parents-enfants.
about the contact with their fathers.
Et ce qui est aussi important de souligner,
And it's also
c'est que
important to
dans certains
underscore
cas,
that in some
c'est
of
pas
the
nécessairement qu'on n'a
cases,
pas
it isn't so
sollicité leur
much
point de
that
vue, mais il y
their
avait clairement
viewpoint
des
was not
exemples où
asked
les
for, but
professionnels
there
ou
were
différents
clear
intervenants impliqués
examples where a
n'ont
number
pas
of
réussi, n'ont pas
professionals
été en mesure de créer
were
un espace
unable to
où
create
les
a
enfants se sentent
space
sentis
where
suffisamment en sécurité
children
ou
felt
confortables
safe
pour
enough and
partager leur point de
comfortable
vue.
enough in
Vous
order
avez
to
encore
share
une
their
fois un exemple
viewpoints.
ici à
And
l'écran
once
où
again, here's an example of that on screen.
c'est Lily, une jeune de
And this
11 ans,
is
qui
Lily, she's
raconte en
11
fait
years old.
que lorsqu'elle a
And she
rencontré la
says
policier
that
pour
when
la
she met
première
with the
fois,
police
elle
officer for
avait
the first
amené avec
time,
elle un tout
she
petit
had brought her teddy bear with her,
permettait de se sentir
which made
plus
her
en
feel
sécurité
comfortable and
et
more
que les
safe,
policiers ont
and
refusé
that
en
the
fait qu'elle
police
amène avec
officers,
elle le
in
toutou
fact,
dans la salle
refused
pour
to allow her to
l'interrogatoire. Et
bring
pour elle, c'était vraiment
the
une
teddy bear
occasion
into
en fait,
the
ça venait vraiment
room,
miner cette
the
possibilité-là
interview
d'avoir un
room,
espace
and
où elle
it
se
made
sentait
it
confortable et en
impossible for her
sécurité.
to be in
Heureusement, par la
a
suite, sa
place
mère
where
est
she felt
intervenue et
safe.
a réussi à
But
convaincre les
her
policiers,
mother
mais Lily nous a quand même
intervened and
parlé de cette
convinced them to allow
situation-là
the teddy
où
bear.
les
But we
policiers lui avaient
talked about
interdit
this,
d'amener
where
un toutou avec
the
elle
police officers had refused
lors
the
de
child
l'interrogatoire.
to bring her teddy bear when she was in
Toujours par
the
rapport à
room.
l'espace,
Again, when it comes to
on a
space,
pu quand même constater
we did
que
note
pour certains participants, ils
that
avaient
for
eu,
some of the
à travers les
participants
procédures,
in
accès à
the
des
proceedings,
espaces
they were able to access
où
spaces
ils avaient eu des occasions
where they had
d'exprimer
the
leur point de vue
opportunity
et
to
des
express
professionnels qui ont
themselves,
réussi effectivement à
and
créer un
health
espace où
professionals
ils
were
se
able
sentaient
to
suffisamment en sécurité et
develop a
confortables
space where they felt
pour le
sufficiently
faire.
safe and
Dans
comfortable
l'extrait
to speak
ici,
out. And in
une
this
question
excerpt that we
d'une
have,
d'une
this is
avocate.
a lawyer. It is about a
L'enfant
lawyer,
parle
rather.
très positivement de
And
rencontres
the
avec,
child
avec
speaks
son
very
avocate. C'est un
positively
sujet quand
about her
même
meeting with
récurrent,
the lawyer.
mais on a
And that's an
aussi, à
important
travers
issue. And
les propos des enfants, d'autres
thanks
exemples
to the
où,
children's
par exemple,
comments,
au
we
service
see other
social, de
examples where, for
l'encadrement de
example,
l'adolescence jeunesse,
social
vont aussi
workers or
réussir
child protection
à créer ces
services,
espaces-là et à donner
interveners were able
l'opportunité
to
aux
develop these
avocats des enfants
spaces and
d'une
give the
certaine
children
manière
an
leur point de
opportunity
vue concernant
to
les contextes
express
avec
their
leurs parents.
viewpoints regarding
Le
the context they'd
deuxième
had with their
élément qui est
fathers.
évidemment
And the
intimement
second
relié à
point that is, of
l'espace,
course,
c'est la
closely
voix. Donc,
tied to
l'espace, c'est
space
de
is the
donner des
voice.
opportunités
The
de
space
créer un
gives
espace
an
sécuritaire et
opportunity
confortable.
to provide a comfortable,
La
secure
voix, en fait,
area.
c'est
And
est-ce que les
voice
enfants
is
ont
whether or
la
not the children
capacité, la
have the
possibilité
ability
d'exprimer leur
and
point de
the
vue
possibility of
à travers
expressing
les
and
processus.
sharing their perspectives
Il y a
throughout
quand
their
même certains
proceedings.
enfants qui nous ont dit
Some of the
que
children did
c'était,
tell
ça avait
us
été difficile pour
that
eux
it
de
was
parler
difficult
de la
for
relation
them
avec
to speak
leur
about the
père,
relationship with their
que c'est
father.
pas, comme le disait Léandre, c'est pas la
And
partie qui a
as we
été la
heard,
plus
it
facile dans le
wasn't the
processus, ça a
easiest
été
part in the legal
assez difficile. Et
proceedings.
ça,
And
je
in
pense
fact, it was quite
qu'il
difficult
faut
for
en
them.
tenir compte
And I think that's something we need to take
lorsqu'on
into
intervient auprès
consideration when we
des enfants.
work with children.
Par contre, ce que
And,
les enfants nous ont
however,
aussi
the
dit,
children
c'est
also
que
told us
malgré le fait que c'était
that
difficile,
despite the fact
le
that it was
fait
difficult,
d'avoir été en
the
mesure
fact that
de
they were
nommer,
able
d'exprimer
to
leur point de vue,
identify
de
and
nommer
express their
certaines
point of view
préoccupations,
and to raise some of the
d'être capable aussi de
concerns they had
nommer
had,
leurs
and that they were
préférences ou de
also
donner leur
able
opinion,
to
que ça a
identify
été
their
quand
preferences
même
and
quelque
share their
chose de
opinions
positif et que ça a
was
été
positive
en
for
fait une
them.
source
And in
d'empowerment.
fact,
En fait,
this was a
le mot
source of
responsabilité,
empowerment.
mais je ne sais pas
And
c'est quoi le mot qu'on devrait voir
we
actuellement sur la
have the
diapositive,
word
mais ça a été finalement
responsibility here, but
pour
that's
eux une
not
source
quite the one
d'empowerment, une
that
source
we
de
mean. It was a
reprise de
source of
pouvoir
empowerment or
nommer les choses, nommer leurs
reappropriating power where they're
préoccupations.
able to
Et dans
identify
l'extrait
things
que
and
vous avez
identify their
ici,
concerns. And the
ce sont les
excerpt we
propos de
see here
Ève, qui avait 17 ans
comes
à
from
l'époque.
Eve, who was 17
Ce
years
qui
old
est
at the time.
intéressant, c'est que
What's of
Ève
interest here
exprime à
is
quel
that
point le fait
Eve
d'avoir été capable de
explains the
nommer ces
fact that she
choses-là,
was able
ben, ça
to
lui a
say
permis de
these
reprendre
things,
du pouvoir
allowed her
sur sa vie.
to
C'est sûr qu'on
reappropriate
va le
her
voir
life.
dans les prochaines
And we'll
diapositives,
see
il
that
ne
in
faut
the
pas
next slides as well.
sous-estimer les
We should
autres
never
composantes qui sont
underestimate the
aussi
other
essentielles pour
components that are
favoriser la
as
participation
important
réelle
when it
des
comes to
enfants,
fostering
notamment l'audience
children's real
et
participation,
l'influence.
among other things,
Mais
that's
ce
the
qui est
hearing
intéressant ici,
and
c'est que
the
Ève,
influence.
dans ce
But
contexte-ci,
what's
elle
true
s'est
here
pas
is that Eve, in
sentie
this particular
elle s'est pas
environment,
sentie
did
comprise
not
par
feel
les
that she was
intervenants,
listened
mais le fait
to or
d'avoir pu
understood
nommer les
by
choses,
the
ça a
various interveners,
circulé
but
était
she was
en
able
soi
to
pour
say
elle
certain things
une
and she was
source
able to express, and that in and of
d'empowerment
itself
ou
was
de
a source
reprise
of empowerment
du pouvoir.
or
Donc,
a
il y a quelque
means
chose
of
d'intéressant quand même
reappropriating power.
dans ça,
So I
bien
think that's
que
important,
c'est quand même important pour les jeunes d'être
although
aussi
it is
écoutés,
important for
compris
young people to also be listened
par la
to
suite.
and to be
C'est
understood.
encore mieux dans ces
And
cas-là.
of course,
La
that's even better in
troisième
these
dimension qui
cases.
fait
Now,
référence
the
à
third
ce que Lundy appelle
dimension
l'audience, en fait, c'est
refers
le
to
fait
what
d'avoir
Lundy
quelqu'un
calls the
qui
hearing,
est
is to
capable
have
d'accueillir
somebody
et de
who's
recevoir les
able
propos des
to
enfants. Parce que c'est bien
welcome
d'avoir
and to
un
receive the
espace, c'est
children's
bien pour les
comments.
enfants pour
It's
pouvoir
good to have a
s'exprimer,
space.
mais
It's good
encore
that
faut-il
children
qu'il y ait
can
quelqu'un
express
qui soit là
themselves,
pour les
but they
écouter
do have to
et
have
pour
somebody there who's
recevoir
able to listen
ces
to them
propos-là.
and to welcome those
Et
comments.
encore une fois, les enfants ont
So
eu
once
des
again,
expériences
the children
assez diversifiées
had
par
very
rapport à ça.
differing
Et
experiences on this level,
certains des participants
and
nous ont
some of
partagé des
the
expériences où ils
participants
ne
also
s'étaient pas
shared
du tout
experiences
sentis
with us where they did not at
écoutés
all feel that they
par
were
leurs
heard
interlocuteurs ou
by the
interlocutrices.
persons they were working with, the
Et je
interveners.
trouvais qu'à cet égard-là,
And I thought that on that
l'extrait, les
level,
propos de Gérard étaient
Gerard's
très
comments
parlants
were
parce
very
que, en fait,
telling,
Gérard va
because
même
Gérard
jusqu'à questionner
is
pourquoi
even
la
calling into
protection de la
question
jeunesse, ça
why
s'appelle la
Youth
protection de la
Protection
jeunesse,
Services
parce
is
que,
called Youth
selon lui,
Protection
ça devrait
Services,
pas
because
s'appeler comme ça
according to
parce
him,
qu'ils sont
that's
pas
not
capables
what
d'écouter
the
les
name
enfants.
should be, because they're
Donc,
unable to really listen to
et il y a
children.
quand même un thème récurrent
And that's a
chez les
recurrent
enfants
theme
à
that we
l'effet qu'il
see
y a
in
quand
children
même été en
who
contact avec
indicate
certains
that
professionnels
they are in
qui,
contact with
en
a
fait,
number of
ne
professionals,
sentaient pas qu'il y avait
but they
une
did
écoute
not
là,
feel
réelle
that
de leurs
they were truly being
propos et de
listened
leur
to,
point de vue.
that their
Et un
viewpoints were
des
not
thèmes, je
heard.
dirais, qui ressort
And
aussi de façon
again, one of the
récurrente par
themes that
rapport à
we
ça,
see occur quite frequently is that children often felt that rather than being listened to, the various social workers or professionals very quickly tried to convince them to make them change their minds. And that's something that a lot of children reproach the professionals for. And here you see Eden's comments. He was 15 years old, and he said that he did not want to see his father at that point. And very quickly, the professional told him, well, you'll always need your father, even though there is violence, etc. So the feeling he had is that rather than being heard, the professionals were quickly trying to convince them and make them change their minds. And certainly that does not foster participation or help the children. However, some of the children did indicate that they had worked with professionals and workers who really listened to them. And I think this is something that's interesting and that we're seeing in some of the children's comments who took part in the project, because they said some of the professionals really listen to them, others don't. And they said, yes, a lot of professionals meet with us and they ask me all kinds of questions because that's what they have to do. That's a comment we heard, but we don't have the sense that they're really listening to us compared to the excerpts that we're seeing here, where they really had an impression that they were working with professionals who were really interested in their point of view and that they were truly listening to them. And especially, it gave them the feeling that these professionals were focused on what the children had to say. And they demonstrated this interest, whether this be by a certain attitude or by non-verbal language, but they really showed that they were interested in the child's reality and their viewpoint. And there's an interesting situation here is that Mauve is experiencing. She was 15 years old. Once again, I absolutely don't want to minimize the importance, and we'll come back to this, of ensuring that children feel that they're being listened to, and again, that this can lead to a number of tangible actions. But here we have Mauve, who's telling us that even though when the decisions were not the ones the children would have preferred, the fact that she felt listened to and that there was a lawyer who took the time to listen to her and to transmit her comments, her preferences, was something that was very positive in her mind. So once again, we shouldn't underestimate how important it is to see these decisions. But even when the decisions are not the ones that children would have preferred, it's important that your child felt that he or she was listened to and felt involved in the process can make a difference and can make the experience more positive from their viewpoints. So let us move on to the fourth dimension. That is influence. Influence is an extremely important component. It was also important in the participants' comment. Influence is the action of taking action on what the children have reported, what they're saying. It means that when children speak out, or when they state their opinion, that this leads to a number of changes or to a number of concrete outcomes. It is an important component of their participation. And it's clear that for those children who took part in the project, influence is a little bit the final test. At the end of the day, it is what enables them to see whether or not they were listened to and understood or not. Because if they had really been taken into account, this led to changes. Whereas if at the end of the day there was no change at all, it might be a signal that they were not listened to and that they were not allowed to fully participate in the process. And it's clear that among those children that we met with, a number of the children spoke about situations where unfortunately the decisions taken did not give rise to any change. And one such example is Nessa here, and that's the first excerpt. We see her here up on the slide, who told us very clearly that she no longer wanted to speak to her parent, but despite that, she had to meet him. And for her, this was tied to the fact that the professionals did not understand her and did not listen to her and did not listen to what she wanted. And what a number of young people also mentioned to us, and we see that, is they would have liked to see the professionals making an effort to better understand the children's perspective by asking more questions, by going a bit further. Sometimes they had the impression that the professionals didn't really try to understand their concerns, why it is that they were saying certain things. And what some of the young people also told us is that sometimes they would have liked professionals to have looked into different options for the children and the things that professionals said were not possible at that point. But they thought maybe we could have looked at various options, various possibilities with them, rather than simply heading towards a solution which really did not take into account their own viewpoints and their preferences. But fortunately, we also received more positive statements respecting this fourth dimensions. And as I mentioned earlier, these are cases where young people had the sense that they had been truly consulted, that they had been heard, and that this translated into a real change into the life of the young person. So it made a true difference. And that's what we see in the quotes here, the citations on screen here. And Eve is telling us that it's quite lengthy, but she said that there were many challenges and difficulties. But at a certain point, a social worker came and said, look, we made a decision, Manon, and you no longer have to see your father because it's not in your interest. And she felt that at long last she was listened to and she was understood. So those are the four dimensions that were identified by Lundy, as I mentioned earlier. So clearly the data that we collected show that it is very important to put in place these four dimensions. But there is another dimension that relates to information. And the children told us that they often had limited access to information. As a result, it was difficult for them to truly understand exactly what was taking place. It was also difficult for them to make decisions that were informed, but overall, the children wanted to have more access to information. And in some cases, actually, where they did have access to information, it wasn't through the various professionals, but it was really thank you to their mothers who were able to make up for this shortcoming. They saw that very positively, but we also know that this can place the mothers and children in a complicated situation and sometimes a delicate one when it comes to sharing information about contact as part of a relationship, where the child might wonder who among all of the professionals involved holds the responsibility for sharing the information with the children to keep them informed about all of the different proceedings. So this brings me to our second theme, and I see that time is flying. And our second theme is about children's experiences regarding the father-child contact. Obviously, the children's experiences is always complicated, it's always diverse, but there were a number of recurring themes that we were able to identify on the basis of the children's comments. And these referred to negative emotions and also to a number of positive aspects. But among the negative emotions that we saw the most often, obviously that won't come as a surprise to you to know that fear was one of the points that was raised in the comments of a number of the participants. And fear was not only due to incidences of physical violence, but due to a number of behaviors that might be manifested by their father. And I think what's interesting here, specifically in the quote that you see here by Leandre, is that Leandre says this. She says, even though her father made efforts to organize activities and to do more positive things, she was still afraid. Specifically because, and this was said higher up in the quote, because I never knew what he was going to do. There was unpredictable, he was unpredictable, and when I was young, I was always afraid. A number of the young persons also spoke about sadness. Regarding the relationship with their father. And whether this be fear or sadness, all of this was tied to behavior that their father had or continued to manifest vis-a-vis them, as well as vis-a-vis their mother and siblings. Another emotion that was mentioned often was anger. A lot of the young people told us that they were angry with their father. And what's of interesting here, and you see that in these two quotes, is that often anger has to do with the violent behavior, the fact that they're subjected to this, that their mother was subjected to it, but also because they had the feeling that they were being manipulated. And specifically in a post-separation context, where their father, for some of them, several of them, said that he had changed, that this would no longer happen. And despite all of this, they felt that he was being manipulative and this was not true change. And that led to a great of anger in the young persons. And finally, some of the participants also spoke about anxiety, which is due to the contact with their fathers. And there are some very powerful situations, but I think what's important here is to point out we have a Juliette who said that it's important to understand and that she feels anxiety not only when she's with the father, but she's anxious even when they're not with him. That the relationship and contact with the father can be a source of anxiety, even though they may not physically be in the same place. They may not be together. So again, as I mentioned, there are negative emotions, but there are also positive elements that we saw in the comments made by the young people. And a lot of them had to do with the good memories that they had. And in some of the young persons, they spoke about the past when there was no violence yet, and things were doing well, and they had very positive memories of their fathers. There's also the fact that sometimes they were able to do activities with their father and spend time with him. And sometimes they said that they were also able to play video games. So there were some very concrete things that the young people were speaking about. But when you read their comments and when you speak with them, I think what we need to draw from this is that these positive elements don't neutralize all of the negative experiences they've had, everything that they've been subjected to. And these positive elements aren't necessarily tied to a feeling of safety or well-being either. And certainly they are not an indicator of safety or well-being for the children. But these things may be present. So in light of all this, what are the young people saying? What conditions would they have liked to see put in place by the professionals regarding contact with their fathers? Well, I'd say that the main theme that we saw in all of the young persons' comments that we met with is that they all would have liked to see their fathers stop behaving violently. And that is something that we see that is an ongoing trend. It was controlling violent behavior, and that was true for all of the young people that we met with. And they want to see it stop against them. Also, they would like to see the father stop behaving like that towards their mother as well as their siblings. And as we're going to be seeing in the next few minutes, whether or not the children want to see their fathers and have contact with them, they all want this violent behavior to stop and this controlling behavior to stop. What we also saw was that in addition to seeing an end to this violent and controlling behavior, there are three main conditions that were raised in the comments made by the participants. And the first conditions that emerged was that the young people wanted to be able to choose when they would see their father and how often they would see him. Some of them wanted to have contact with their father, but they wanted to be the ones to decide how often and at what time that would occur, because some of them did not want to see the father. So that was the first conditions to ensure that contact could be safe and comfortable for them. And the second conditions that emerged from the participants' comments is that they wanted others to be there. Again, it's a matter of safety. As conditions of safety and supervisions, for example, they wanted to ensure that there would be the presence of others when they were with their fathers so that they could feel safe. And what's interesting in both of the quotes here, and I think that says a great deal about safety, is that Eve and Leandre both spoke about police officers. They felt safer when there were police officers around. Leandre would like to have had a security person there, a bodyguard. And it's interesting that Leandre is saying this. She was saying that the person needs to understand, her father needs to understand who he really is, because he's charming. And he really, and again, I'm paraphrasing, but he needs to be somebody who understands the issues. And it's important to be somebody who understands who he is and not allows themselves to be charmed by him. And their third conditions is beyond stopping this abusive behavior, is what the children wanted, is they wanted to be treated with respect during contact with their father. Mean a number of different things, but for example, treat me like someone my age, or we'd like to see, I'd like to see my father to stop lying and stop trying to buy her affection. So beyond simply stopping this controlling behavior, he should have consideration for the young people, or the father should. So the young people identify a number of conditions under which contact would be possible safely. And however, in a number of young people that we met with, some of the children, there was really a point of no return that had been reached. And for some of them, there was almost nothing more that the father could do to ever think that contact might be reestablished, or that this contact might be safe and comfortable. And the young people said this often with a great deal of emotion. It isn't because they didn't want to see their father or spend positive time with him, but they really felt that it was just no longer possible at that point. And for these young people, this was often due to the fact that there were so many things that had been tried. They had had expectations from their fathers, and unfortunately, none of this have ever had a positive outcome. They had really concluded at that point that it was no longer possible, that it could no longer happen. And some of the young people also told us that at that stage, they no longer had any hope that their father would change, and they no longer had any expectations of him. And so once again, if you look at the bottom of this quote here, and it says, my mom said she's tried so many times, and now she no longer has any expectations because it was never positive, says Mauve. So for these young people, there was this point of no return that was achieved. So I only have a few minutes left, but this brings me to the last dimension. And maybe this is more exploratory in nature, but I think it's important for us to give thought to the concept of reparation for children who've lived in an environment of intimate partner violence when it comes to contact with their fathers. Because very often will recommend or order that contact should be resumed with the father, and everybody will act as if nothing happened at all and won't think about what might be put in place in order to launch this process or repair process. So when we talked about it with children, I think it's important to mention that it isn't so much about the conditions, to the extent that some of these young people, even though they had reached a point of no return and they no longer wanted to see their father, they would nevertheless have appreciated a repair process to be put in place, if only so that at a certain point they could turn over a new leaf and move on to something, a new page and move on to something age. And again, this is what the process of repair is with young people. And the very first thing we have to do is to, first of all, foremost, they want to see him recognize what he's done, that he take responsibility, that he apologizes, that any changes. Really, the idea is that he acknowledge, apologizes, and takes responsibility. And thus, this also leads to a change and again to stop behaving violently and controlling. So all of this leads me to my conclusion, again, to stress the importance. And again, I realize I do have a slide that seems to have disappeared. I apologize for that, but I'd like to conclude on explaining how important it is to take into account the viewpoint and experience of children and the young persons. So we had children who were as young as 5 years old who have a viewpoint, who have things to say, but it's important to put in place the conditions where they feel comfortable and safe to speak out. But again, we have to take them seriously, and it's important to take this into account. And again, I think it's important to call into question the idea of absolutely maintaining contact with the child, that this is always in the best interest of the children. It isn't that the children don't want to have contact with their fathers, but in some circumstances, that's simply no longer possible to do this in a safe and comfortable way. And it's only possible to understand if we take the time to really listen to the children and to take them seriously. And I think we need to put in place all of the necessary proceedings to ensure that the children are protected, but also that they retain their rights to take part. And again, these are two interconnected rights, and they have to be safe, they have to be able to participate, but it's also important to allow them to participate, and to do so, we have to be able to listen to them so that we can better protect them.
Merci beaucoup, Simon,
Thank you
pour
very much, Simon,
cette présentation.
for your
Et
presentation.
merci
And
particulièrement par
in
rapport au niveau
particular,
du détail là, partagé dans toutes les citations d'enfants
thanks
qui nous permettent
for
de mieux
all
comprendre
the
leur expérience et leur
quotes
point
from
de vue
children
dans
who
ces
enabled us to
différents
see
contextes.
what their
On a reçu plusieurs
experience
questions
and
de ces questions
perspectives
d'enfants. On a reçu
were.
plusieurs questions
We've gotten a
et il
number
est
of
sûrement
questions,
besoin à Katrina
and
pour
I'm going to
faire cet
work
échange.
with
La
Katrina
première question
on responding to them.
qui est
The first
ressortie
question that
ici,
came
c'est
out was,
comment on peut s'assurer
how
que
can you
la
ensure
participation des enfants,
that
elle ne devienne
the
pas comme une forme
child's
de responsabilisation implicite
participation
de leur
doesn't
sécurité ou du maintien des groupes
become an implicit way of showing that they're safe, or
Est-ce que tu veux que je réponde maintenant?
do you want me to ask
Oui.
now?
Oui, ok,
Yes,
non,
yes.
c'est bon.
Okay.
Ben, en fait, je comprends cette
I
préoccupation-là,
I
mais à
understand
mon
this
avis, c'est un
concern,
peu
but in my opinion,
en fait, je pense que mais c'est pas une fausse préoccupation parce qu'il est légitime,
it's
cette
not a
préoccupation-là,
false
mais en même temps,
concern,
ce que
the
les enfants
accountability of the
nous ont
child, in
dit,
fact.
et ça
What the
reflète aussi
children
ce
are
qui sort
telling
du
us,
projet, c'est
and what's coming
vraiment
from
le
other
problème actuellement,
research,
ce n'est
is
pas
that the
qu'on
problem
les
today is not
consulte trop ou
that
que
they're
c'est
being
une
over-consulted
surresponsabilisation.
or
Ce que
they're
les enfants, les
being
jeunes nous disent,
made
c'est au
too
contraire, vous ne nous
accountable. The
consultez pas
children are saying,
assez, vous ne nous
no, it's
créez
that
pas
you're not
suffisamment
consulting
d'espace, on
us
peut être
enough,
entendu, on peut être
you're not
consulté,
giving
et
us
vous
enough
ne
space, you're
au
not
sérieux. Donc, je pense
taking us
que
seriously
la
enough.
préoccupation, elle est
So I
légitime, mais
think the concern is
l'état des
legitimate,
choses actuellement, ce n'est pas qu'on les
but it's not that
sur-responsabilise, mais c'est
we're
bien au contraire qu'on
making
les
them
fait,
overly
on leur crée
accountable,
pas assez
but
ces espaces-là.
rather
Après,
that
je
we
dirais qu'une
don't make
façon
enough
peut-être
space for them. And then
d'éviter en fait ce
there,
piège-là,
there's
c'est
a
peut-être
way
d'être très
to get
transparent
around
avec
this
les
trap.
enfants
You
sur
have
le
to be
fait que
very transparent
ultimement,
with
c'est
the
quand même pas
children and
eux qui
tell
vont
them
prendre
that
qui vont prendre la
they are
décision, hein, parce
not the
qu'ils ont le
ones
droit
who
de
are going to
participer,
make the
mais ils
decision.
n'en ont pas le
They have a
pouvoir
right
de
to
décision.
participate, but
Donc,
they don't
d'être
have any
clair et
decision-making
transparent
power.
avec les
So
enfants qu'on
we
veut
have to
les
be
entendre,
clear and
qu'on
transparent with
veut
the children and
savoir quels sont leurs
ensure that they
préférences, quel est
know
leur
we
point de
want
vue,
to
qu'on
hear
veut
them, we
emmener
want
compte
their
réellement dans les procédures,
perspective,
mais que
and that it will be
l'enfant
taken
doit
into
aussi
account
savoir
in the
que ultimement
procedures,
la
but the
décision va
child
être
has
prise
to
en
know
tenant
that in the
compte de leur
final
point de vue, mais en tenant
analysis,
compte aussi
the
d'autres
decision will be
éléments et d'autres
made taking
facteurs.
into
Et ça,
account
je pense que ça
their
permet
perspective, but
effectivement de ne pas
also
leur
other
d'éviter de leur
factors.
remettre
And
finalement
that
sur les épaules le poids de la décision parce que
means
ce n'est pas
that we're
eux qui
not
prennent les
putting the
décisions, c'est
weight of
nous.
the decision on their
Mais je pense
shoulders.
ce qu'il faut
We
éviter
make
de
the
faire, en fait,
decisions. But
c'est
what we have to
d'utiliser cette
avoid is using
préoccupation-là,
this
ou que cette
concern,
préoccupation-là nous amène finalement
or
à
that this
éviter de les
concern
consulter, de les
in,
impliquer, et c'est de les impliquer en étant clair que c'est pas
is
eux
such
qui
that
ont
we're
qui ont le
afraid
pouvoir
of
ou le
getting
poids
them
de prendre des
involved. But we
décisions,
just
effectivement.
have to ensure that they understand that the weight of the decision
Merci,
and the
Simon.
responsibility is not on them.
Simon, it makes me think about the conversations that we have often with, particularly with different legal system um, representatives that, not speaking to children isn't protecting them, that is not a good protective strategy, that children are know what is happening and need the chance to have their voice made, as you've emphasized. One of our audience members said that they noticed framing gaps in the parenting skills of kind of mostly fathers who make decisions to employ family violence in the family setting, rather than kind of emotional dysregulation, multi-generational trauma, and links to kind of violence present in our culture, language, and politics. So I think this person is really thinking about violence, but also the kind of context of things that influence parenting. Can you speak to this kind of framing in your work?
So do I need to answer? Sorry, I just want to make sure. Do I answer in English or in French for translation?
In French is
In
fine.
French. OK.
Oh.
Ben, en fait, si je comprends bien la question,
If I've
c'est
understood the question
évidemment
correctly,
il faut, je pense, considérer
I
la violence
think we
conjugale
have
et
to
la
take
réalité
into
des enfants qui
account
vivent dans un
intimate
contexte
partner
de violence
violence and the
conjugale
children
comme
who
un
live in such
problème
environments
social. Il y a des
as a
enjeux
social
sociaux,
problem.
politiques qui
There are
doivent être
socio-political
pris en
issues that
considération.
have to be taken into account.
Évidemment,
Of course,
les hommes qui font le
men
choix d'avoir des
who
comportements violents,
choose to
on le sait que
choose
c'est
violent
généralement
behavior,
multifactoriel et qu'il y
we
a des
know that there
facteurs
are many
également
factors
sociaux. Donc,
uh,
il y a tout un travail
related
à
to
faire en
this.
termes de
So there's a great
prévention,
deal
en
of
termes
work to be
d'adresser les
done in terms
enjeux
of prevention and
sociaux,
addressing
politiques.
social and political issues.
Donc, tout ça est vrai. En même
All of
temps,
this is true, but at the same
j'ai
time,
aussi l'impression que
I also have the impression that
qu'il faut, en fait, lorsqu'on parle aux enfants et aux
when
jeunes qui
we
se
talk
retrouvent dans
to
ces
children and
situations-là,
youth in such
en fait, ils n'ont
situations,
pas le luxe d'attendre
they
qu'on ait
don't
fait
have
des
the
changements
luxury
sociaux et politiques.
of
Ils vivent
waiting for
dans l'ici et
socio
maintenant
political
avec un
changes
parent qui a
to
des
take place.
comportements
They are
violents,
living in the
qui a
here and now with a violent
exposé au
parent.
schéma de comportement de
They've
parents
been
violents dans le passé
exposed
également,
to violent
avec tout ce que ça
behaviors,
suscite chez eux.
and we
Et,
know what this creates in them.
ils veulent finalement qu'on
And what
mette des
they
choses en place
want
pour assurer leur
is for
sécurité, leur
things
bien-être et qu'on
to be
respecte leurs droits dès
corrected
maintenant.
so
Donc, je
that
pense que ce
their
pas des choses
rights
qui
are
sont
respected
mutuellement
and that they feel
exclusives,
safe.
mais je pense qu'il faut faire un
It's
travail
not that these are
plus
two
structurel, plus
exclusive
social, plus
issues,
politique, un
but
travail de
we
prévention
do need
en amont,
to do
mais il faut
prevention
aussi
work
s'assurer que dans l'ici et
upstream,
maintenant, les
but
enfants ont
in
leurs
the here
droits
and now, we have
sont
to ensure that
respectés
children's
et
rights are
qu'ils puissent
respected
vivre dans des conditions
and
qui
that they
sont,
can they be able to live in under safe conditions where their welfare is taken care of. So, but in the question, I'm not sure that the psychological framing helps that much. For me, when I look at what the children are saying to us, they talk about concrete behaviors. They're not asking, why is their father acting this way? Uh, what in his past led him to behave this way? What they talk about are concrete behaviors that have to stop. So, if we really want to evaluate the parenting skills of these parents, it can be done on a factual basis through what the children tell us. And these children are telling us that their parents are making a choice that compromises their security, that's not in their best interests. And this has to be taken into account when we're doing evaluations and making decisions.
Merci Simon. Et
Thank you,
c'est une
Simon.
bonne transition pour la
That's
prochaine
a
question.
great transition
On a
to
une
the next question. We
participante
have a participant
qui nous partage
who
qu'elle est complètement d'accord sur les
says that she
sentiments et souhaite
totally
que les enfants doivent
agrees
être entendus, comme tu nous
that
l'as
children's
bien présenté avec ton
feelings,
conjoint.
we have to
Mais
listen to them.
elle se
But
pose la question parce qu'elle se
she's
dit qu'en
wondering, she
pratique,
says,
quand il n'y a pas
in
d'ordonnance
practice,
judiciaire qui
when
interdit
there's
le
no
contact,
legal order
une mère ne peut pas
prohibiting
légalement
contact, a
empêcher
mother
le
can't
père de voir ses
legally
enfants.
prevent
Dans
the
une
father from
situation où est-ce
seeing the
qu'il y a
children.
où est-ce que une femme
In a
quitte un
situation
conjoint violent, mais
where a
qu'il n'y a
woman
aucune
leaves her
interdiction
violent
qui est en
partner,
place,
but
c'est
there's
quoi
no
les options
prohibition
concrètes qui
order,
peuvent exister
what
pour protéger
are
le
the
conjoint? Si la
concrete
personne, elle
things
parle d'un
that
point de
exist to
vue
help
d'une
the
travailleuse sociale.
child, to protect the child? And she's
Ben, en
speaking
fait,
from the point of view of a
c'est un peu
social
difficile parce
worker.
que chaque
It's a bit
situation
difficult because each
est
situation
unique
is unique.
d'une certaine façon. Donc, il faut voir dans chaque
So
situation
you have to
ce
look
qui
at
est
each
possible.
situation and
Je
see
pense qu'il
what
faut être à
can be done,
l'écoute
what's
de
possible.
ce que
You
les
have to
enfants
be
nous disent. Il faut
sensitive,
prendre au sérieux
listening to
leurs
what the children are
préoccupations.
saying and
Mais
take their
si
concerns
on ne peut
seriously.
pas arriver
And if there is no
en
way,
fait,
or
et malheureusement, parfois le parent violent,
and unfortunately, the violent
ben,
parent
va pas nécessairement faire les choix qui priorisent les
is
enfants et qui
not
sont dans le
necessarily
sens du
making
meilleur intérêt de
choices
l'enfant. Donc, si on a un parent
in the
violent
best
qui n'est
interests of
pas
the child.
prêt
But if the
à
violent parent is
respecter dans
not
ce
ready
contexte-là les
to
souhaits de l'enfant et
respect
qui pose certaines
the
actions ou qui fait certaines
wishes of the
demandes
child
ou a
and
certaines
asks for
exigences
certain
qui
things
fait
or
que
makes
l'enfant ne se sent
certain
pas en
demands
sécurité, ne se
and
sent pas confortable, ben à ce moment-là, ben,
that would be
malheureusement,
such
il
that the
faut
child
faire
wouldn't
appel
feel
à des
safe.
professionnels, il faut peut-être
Unfortunately, you
entamer
have
des
to call in
procédures
professionals and
et en
perhaps
espérant que les différents
take
professionnels qui
steps
seraient
to
impliqués aient des
so that these
connaissances si des
professionals
mesures ont été
are
reprises pour bien comprendre
aware
la
of
problématique,
what's
mais
going
aussi
on
pour
and
mettre les
can
conditions en place pour
properly
qu'ils prennent
assess the
toute
situation
des enfants. Donc, je suis conscient que
and
c'est pas
thus
simple, c'est pas
create
idéal, mais
an environment where
euh,
the child is heard. I
faut
know it's not
s'entendre volontairement
easy.
sur qu'est-ce qui est
Yes,
souhaitable et puis
you
quand
can
c'est pas
have a
possible, ben, malheureusement,
voluntary agreement
faut
on
faire appel aux
what's
institutions.
best, but if not, then you have to ask the institutions to act. Thank you.
Okay, so I feel like I'm a bit on the same road. I want to open up the question of the multiple questions of therapy and counseling. And so when we look at what people have asked about, some people are reflecting that often children and youth don't have access to therapy. They don't get any therapy that they need. On the other hand, somebody talks about the fact that sometimes within one family court, one parent successfully convinces the court to order therapy for a child so that therapy is happening. And then another person asks, well, how trained are people to work in this space to really understand children's experience, especially in cases of post-separation violence? I give you all of that, Simone, to pick up which part you would like to.
Ben, en fait, j'aimerais réagir à la question de la thérapie, en fait, parce que
I'd like
je trouve la question
talk about
extrêmement
therapy.
pertinente,
I think this is a
mais
very
je me
relevant
permets
question,
y répondre de façon un peu
but
indirecte, dans le
my
sens
answer will be
où
somewhat indirect
je pense que c'est
in that
important
it's
de
important
nommer que les
to
jeunes et les
identify the
enfants qu'on
fact
a
that
rencontrés ne nous
young
ont pas
people and
nécessairement
children
parlé
that
de
we meet don't necessarily talk about therapy. They told us that they'd met with psychologists, lawyers, social workers, police officers. They identified various professionals with whom they'd met. And I'm not at all against therapy. I'm not saying that it might not be beneficial for some of these young people. But what's important to remember is that therapy sometimes enables children to participate further. When the child goes into therapy, you create a space where the child can speak and can be listened to. But therapy as such does not bring about real concrete changes in the life of the child. That might perhaps better protect the child or change custody orders so when we talk about taking into account the point of view of the child when making decisions, therapy is not a bad thing, but therapy is not necessarily what's going to enable the child to fully participate in the process. In as much as this full participation must lead to concrete changes. Therapy leads to response to other needs, but it doesn't necessarily lead to a more comfortable, safe environment for the child. But it will give the child a space to express him or herself, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there will be safe contact. And when you look at the various professionals, and I don't want to generalize because we only have a very small sample here, but what came out, what was very positive, was the role of the lawyers. The children often spoke positively of the lawyers who represented them. And they said that the lawyers gave their point of view to the judges so that a decision could have been made or changes could be made for them. This was not a therapeutic context. This was in context where the lawyers created conditions to foster children's participation, and this led to a real change in their living conditions and improved their safety. So I think it's really important to distinguish between the two. Afterwards, access to support resources is good, and we know there are not enough, in particular group programs for children. I think there's a critical link of this. In terms of training, well, it's not, it's quite unequal. There is a need for training. There is a need for training on intimate partner violence and children that live in such environments. But in order to foster children's participation, you also need knowledge and skills that are very specific. I think we need more training, and we have to develop more skills regarding children's participation and children's rights, and not just regarding the issue of intimate partner violence. We need both.
Merci Simon. On
Thank you
avait
so
une
much,
autre
Simon.
question
We had
qui,
another question
justement, en lien avec l'intervention. Il y a une personne
about
qui nous dit
the
qu'elle a travaillé
intervention.
avec plusieurs
One
jeunes
person
garçons qui ont
says that
vécu
they work with a
dans des
number of young
environnements avec
boys
de la violence
who
conjugale
had
et qui
lived in an
venaient
environment
à
where
avoir
there
des
was
contacts avec
intimate
leur
partner
père
violence,
et
and
que souvent leur père n'était
they
pas disponible ou ne
wanted
souhaitait
to
pas
have
avoir
contact
des
with their
ces
parents, but
contacts-là.
often he was
Et
never
la personne a dit
available. They
c'est pour
couldn't
ces
have the
garçons de
safe
faire le
context.
deuil de cette
And
relation qui
it was said that it was
et de
difficult for
concilier
these
la colère et le
young
chagrin.
boys
Est-ce que
to
tu as
really
décidé sur ce
set
genre de
aside this, and it
situation
caused a lot of
ou une
anger
manière
and a lot of
d'aider
grief?
ces enfants?
Do you have any means of helping these youngsters? Well, there might be various possibilities. And again, I'm not at all surprised to hear that because it's not only young men. We saw that in excerpts that I indicated earlier, is that several of the young women also would have liked to have safe contact with their fathers. It's not so much about the wish of having contact that doesn't exist, but it's about the conditions and the father's behaviors in a number of situations that makes reach this point of no return. And then I think there are a number of points that come to mind, but I think it's important to first and foremost established the various conditions that foster children's participation. Because, as some of the young people said, even if at the end of the day it hasn't led to the desired outcome, the fact they said that I was heard, I was listened to, that I was taken seriously, that we were able to speak about what was taking place, it has made a difference and it made my experience more positive. So I take it that this could also apply to this particular context. And there's another point that might be especially important in this case. It is how crucial it is to simply be listening, to validate, and not to quickly, as some young people were saying, jump to try to convince them or to make them change their minds, just to allow the young person to express that they're experiencing a number of emotions, that they're frustrated, they're experiencing stress, just to listen to them and validate that. And perhaps in some cases, as this young person said, there might be different options possible that could be explored. For example, the father is never available for whatever reason. There might be things that could be put in place that even could lead to some kind of relationship with the father, even if there is no direct contact. So the idea is sometimes to be creative and be willing to explore a number of different options. So perhaps even if the child tells us after that it's not possible, but if we explore these different options with the child, it might be possible to come up with something that is satisfactory. But if at the end of the day the child is not happy with or satisfied with the decision, if he feels that he was not truly listened to or consulted, the risk is that the child, or if he feels that he's been listened to, rather, he'll be less frustrated and less angry against the process. Thank you.
Simon, it really reminds me of conversations with youth who have come together as young adults and reflected on their experience in the family court system, and both whether or not their voices are heard and the value of being heard. Also, that things changed for them over time, that they wanted different levels of involvement at different times, and that being able to have that flexibility was something that was helpful. Okay, I know that you get these kinds of questions a lot, so I'm going to put a few together.
Okay.
So, what do you suggest that people do when, maybe the OCL is giving information that maybe doesn't feel very accurate or true around child voice, or, you can't get counsel for children involved, or the judges don't seem to be taking this into account, or maybe the lawyer is dismissive. So there's what an actor within the system is really downplaying the importance of children's voice and perspective. Any thoughts on what can be done?
Ben, c'est quand même difficile parce que je veux dire, il y a tout un, on le sait en
Well,
fait,
that's
il y a tout un
difficult because we
système qui
know
doit
that
être
there's an
qui doit
entire
être
system
amélioré.
behind this that needs to be
Et c'est
improved,
difficile
and we know that it's
en
difficult
fait, c'est difficile de le faire sur une base
to do
individuelle
this
parce
individually.
qu'il y a des changements
We
plus
know
structurels, plus significatifs
that
qui doivent
there are
s'opérer
changes in the
dans le
structure,
système.
more
Euh,
in-depth changes that
et
need
je
to
pense
be
que
brought into the system.
et ça répond peut-être pas
And
parfaitement
I
à la
know that
question,
doesn't
mais je
quite
pense
answer
que
your question
d'abord,
perfectly, but
d'avoir
first of
quelqu'un qui
all, I
peut
think it's
écouter l'enfant et le
important to have
prendre au
somebody there who
sérieux
can listen to the
et
child
valider ce
and
qu'il
take
vit
the child
déjà, c'est
seriously
un
and
pas
to
dans la bonne
validate
direction.
their
C'est pas
experience. That's
suffisant pour avoir une
a right,
participation
a
pleine et
good step in
entière,
the right
mais
direction.
si on a
It's
un
not
enfant
the
qui a l'impression que personne l'écoute, personne ne le prend au
end of the
sérieux,
day solution,
ben
but if the
déjà
child
de
feels
prendre
that
le temps
nobody's listening to
d'écouter, de le
him or her
valider, de le
and
prendre au
takes them
sérieux,
seriously
même si on
already,
n'est peut-être pas
taking the
quelqu'un
time
qui
to
a un
listen to them and to
pouvoir
validate them and to take
d'influence, un
them
pouvoir
seriously,
décisionnel,
even
ça
though
peut
we
quand
may not have
même
any
être
decision-making
un
power,
élément
it may
positif
be a
en soi.
positive element in and
Après,
of
je pense qu'il y a
itself.
effectivement
And
toute une
then
réflexion à
I think
faire au
we need
niveau de,
to
et ça revient
also
peut-être à la
think
question de la
through, and
compétence
again,
des
it comes
différents
back to
professionnels
the
à laquelle on
issue
fait
of
référence
the
plus
different
tôt,
professional
mais je
skill
pense
set.
que on a
But
toute une
again, we need
réflexion à
to
faire
think
autour de la
about
participation des
the
enfants, notamment au niveau
participation of children,
des tribunaux de la
especially
famille,
in
et
the
comment est-ce
family
qu'on peut
courts.
essayer de favoriser une
And how can
participation
we
la plus
foster
directe
the
possible des
most
enfants. Parce que souvent, en
direct
fait, les
participation
enfants
possible
ont
of
très
children?
peu d'opportunités
Because
de
often the children
participer.
have a
Et
very little
lorsque la
opportunity
voix
to
des
take
enfants est
part,
entendue,
and when the children's
ben,
voices
souvent
are
c'est
heard,
de façon indirecte à travers
often
des
it's
rapports, à
indirectly through
travers
reports
des professionnels
or
qui ont fait
through
une théorie, une
professionals who conducted an assessment. I'm not saying that this is bad, but we do know the more direct participation is, the better it is. And on that level, perhaps we also need to think about how to allow children to have easier access to information and to legal counsel, to representation, which was questioned by a number of the young people we met with. And I'm not saying that it's the responsibility of the system and the professionals to put these things in place, but the young people we met with saw this failure of the system, where they saw the shortcomings of the system, were able to really be creative, to work their way through it, and they found means of finding a lawyer. They figured out how to find information and reach out to a legal professional. We know that it isn't easy at all, and nor is it easy for youngsters to do this. But I think it's important for us to think about access to justice for young people, and that should equal access for them to information and legal information, as well as better representation, so that they really are able to take possession of their own lives and to appropriate that in their own lives. Simon, I think that's a wonderful transition, because this brings me to ask two questions that are quite similar, having to do with children's ages. In the samples, you showed a 5-year-old child, and that child's comprehension is different from what a 17-year-old's development level would be. In your research, how did you take these elements into account in your analysis? And what happens when you have a child, regardless of their age, who is unable to express themselves verbally and to talk about their experience? Two things. First of all, it's true that a 5-year-old child will have a different comprehension compared to a 17-year-old, but that 5-year-old's child's understanding will also be different from another child of a similar age or of a different age. So my view on these issues, and again, I've given this a great deal of thought over the past few years, is that age is a very poor indicator of capacity or will to take part. And we have some 5-year-olds in this project, 6, 7-year-olds, who express themselves extremely eloquently, who absolutely want to be involved in all of the steps, who have very clearly defined viewpoints and preferences. And then I have met 15, 16, 7-year-olds who were far less articulate, who didn't necessarily want to be actively involved. He didn't necessarily have any clearly defined preferences. So, frankly, I think that when you use the children's age in order to determine or to assess their abilities or their willingness to take part, and I think that's a trap. I think what we need to do, on the contrary, and again, it comes back to this. And I would paraphrase Stephanie Holt, who is a colleague of mine from Dublin, and she's a professor there. She's been actively working for a number of years on children's participation in the context of intimate partner violence. And I was very surprised when she said, "Look, stop calling into question the capacity of children. They have the capacity to take part. The question is not their ability, it's our own ability. It's we who do not have the ability, the capacity to establish all of the right conditions to foster this participation that is complete and full in children in the different proceedings." So there's something that really calls out to me. And again, it's not that resonates with me. It's not whether or not the children have the ability to take part, it's that whether or not we have the necessary skills and everything in place to allow them to participate. And again, as I mentioned, a lot of work has yet to be done on that. Again, I'm sharing my own position on this. I believe that regardless of a child's age, I think we need to ensure that we put everything in place and put in place the required conditions that allow them to speak out, that will listen to them, that we will take them seriously. So we will put in place the right conditions to foster the complete participation of the child regardless of their age. And on a case-per-case basis, we'll adapt to the child, how the child is able to articulate thoughts and what they want. And I think that would be much more favorable when it comes to respecting the rights of the child. And again, we spoke about the space and the voice. I think the idea is to also develop spaces that are accessible, where children might have different means of expressing themselves, different languages, for instance. They might have a different means of expressing themselves because some want to speak about what they've experienced, others prefer to write it down, others prefer to drawings, etc. So once again, it behooves us to be creatives and to see how we can establish the right conditions so that as many children as possible are able to take part. And obviously, if a child is 3 months old, that will be difficult. But as soon as a child can speak and to identify things from 3, 4 years onward, and then we'll see what they say. But again, we need to put in place the right conditions to allow them to express themselves, listen to them, and then we'll see so what weighting we give to that compared to the other factors we take into account in decision making.
Merci.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You know, there are a lot of questions still. I'm going to give you one final one, Simon, before we close off. I think that it's important at the moment in this context, in this world, to think about the things that make us feel hopeful. For me, having this research is hopeful. Being able to profile children's voices in a way that we haven't done in the past is really hopeful. I wonder if you might end us with a couple of things that you are finding hopeful in terms of this space and this work.
En fait, effectivement, moi, je pense que
Well,
s'il y
it's
a
true.
une chose
I
que ce
think if there's
projet-là
one
est
thing
certainement un des projets
that's
les plus
interesting in this project, and no
les plus
doubt,
stimulants, en fait,
this is one of the most
dans lequel
stimulating
j'ai été
projects that
impliqué
I've
depuis
been
toutes les
involved
années que
in
je travaille sur ces
in all of the
questions-là,
years that I've
dans
been
la
working on
mesure
these topics.
où c'est un projet
That
qu'on a
is,
fait
it's a project that we did
avec les jeunes
with young
ont été
people.
impliqués, comme je le
They
disais
were
plus tôt, à
involved, as
toutes
I
les
mentioned
étapes
it,
du
at
processus.
all of the steps of
Et
the
je pense que
process.
si y a des choses positives à
And I think
retenir, en
if
fait,
there
c'est
are positive
qu'effectivement,
things we
les
can glean from
jeunes
this
ont la
is that
capacité de
young
s'exprimer,
people
ont le
have the
souhait, en
ability
fait,
to
de
express
s'exprimer,
themselves. In
de
fact, we
participer,
want them
ont
to
plein
speak
de
out. We
choses à
want them
dire,
to
sont brillants,
be
ont une
involved. They have many things to
compréhension
say.
qu'on
They're brilliant.
sous-estime
They
très,
have a
très souvent.
very much and
Et
very
je pense
often
qu'il
understood
faut
ability
vraiment
to
changer
understand.
notre perception,
I
en
think
fait,
we need to
des
change our
jeunes, des
perception
enfants.
of young
Et
people and
si
of
on leur
children.
faisait plus de place,
And if
si
we
on
made
croyait
more space
davantage en
for them,
eux,
if
si
we
on
believed in
mettait
them more,
davantage les
if
conditions en
we
place pour
put
favoriser
in
leur
place the right
participation, je
conditions
pense
to
que c'est
foster
vrai
their
en lien
participation,
avec des
that's good.
questions
And I
sensibles,
think this is
prévention conjugale,
also
libération de l'enfant, des
ties
choses
back to
qu'on mène des leçons en
intimate partner
préliminaire
violence
général.
and all of
Je
this.
pense
But I
qu'on
think
a
there are
plein de
lessons we need to
choses
learn from
à
this more
apprendre et
generally. There are
on
many
a
things
tout
we can learn.
avantage
And I
à
think it's to
collaborer avec
our
les jeunes,
benefit
à
as
les
well to
valider,
work
à
together with young
reconnaître leur
people, to
expertise
validate them, to acknowledge
et tout
their
le monde
expertise
va
and
s'en sortir
experiences.
gagnant. Et s'il y a une
If we
chose
do
qui
that,
m'a
everybody,
aussi
this will be a win-win
très,
for
très,
everybody.
qui m'a touché en fait à
And I think
travers
there's
ce
something that
projet-là,
really
c'est tous
touched
les
me in
jeunes
this
qui ont vécu
project
des
is all of the
choses
young people
évidemment
who've
extrêmement
experienced
difficiles,
extremely
incluant les
difficult
jeunes qui
things,
participent au
including those
comité de jeunes
who are
co-chercheurs.
on
Et
the
quand on leur
team of
demande pourquoi est-ce
co-researchers.
qu'ils ont décidé
And
de
we
participer au
asked them
projet de
why they
recherche,
wanted to
tous
be
les jeunes
involved in
qu'on
the
a
research
rencontrés m'ont
project.
dit
All of the
on
young
le
people
fait
we met
pour
with
changer le
said
monde,
that
on le fait pour que
we're
les
doing
choses
this to
soient
change the
meilleures.
world.
Peut-être pas pour
We're
nous
doing
parce qu'il
it
est peut-être
to
trop
make
tard,
sure
mais
that
pour que
things
les
get
choses
better.
soient
Maybe not
meilleures
for us, but
pour
we want
d'autres enfants et
things to be
d'autres
better
jeunes
for
qui ont
other
passé par la
young
même
people
place
and
que
children
nous, on est
who
passé.
will be
Et ça, pour
going through
moi,
what
que
we
dans les
went
conditions
through.
dans lesquelles ils ont
And
vécu, parfois continuent de
given the
vivre,
conditions that in some
qu'on puisse
cases they lived
s'impliquer
through and
pour
continue in some cases
améliorer
to be in,
la
is all
situation
there
d'autres
to
jeunes pour
improve the
changer le monde de
situation for
manière plus positive,
other
il y a
young
quand même quelque
people
chose
and to
d'hyper
change the world.
inspirant dans tout
There's
ça.
something really, truly inspiring in this.
Merci beaucoup. Merci,
Thank you very
Simon, pour
much.
ta
Thank you,
présentation et
Simon, for
l'échange.
this
Merci pour toutes
presentation and
ces
this
paroles
exchange.
inspirantes.
Thank you for
Pour
all of these
conclure,
inspiring
on
words.
souhaite
Before
prendre
we
un petit
close,
moment pour
we'd
quelques
like to
remarques finales.
take a
Tout
few
d'abord, merci
moments
à
to
notre
say a
conférencier
few
Simon Lapierre.
remarks. We'd like to thank
Merci
Simon
également
Lapierre, our
aux
presenter. Thank you
interprètes
as well,
québécois,
our
Nathalie et Yvon,
interpreters
aux
Nathalie
interprètes
and
de
Yvon
langues
for
américaines, Alex et
with
Chelsea,
Alex and
et aux
Chelsea for
interprètes de
American
français
and
et anglais,
Quebec Sign
Caroline et
Languages.
Wendy.
And we'd like to thank
Un
Caroline and
remerciement
Wendy
aussi
as
spécial
well for
à
their
tous les collègues du
interpretation.
Learning
And
Network et du
thanks
Centre de
to all of the
connaissances pour leur
colleagues of the Learning
coordination
Network
en
and
arrière et
the
en
Learning
coulisses.
Hub for everything that
Notre
you've done in
prochain
the background.
webinaire aura
Our
lieu le
next
23
webinar
mars
is
avec le
scheduled for
titre
March 23rd.
Explorer
The
la
title is
neurodivergence, le
Exploring
handicap et la
Neurodivergence,
violence dans
Disability, and
l'espace
Gender-Based
vers des
Violence
pratiques plus
towards more
alternatives et
affirming and
accessibles
accessible
avec Patty
practices,
Douglas.
presented by
Merci à
Patty
vous
Douglas.
et à
Thank you
tous.
so much. Thank you to everybody.